Hey y'all, welcome to Book Marketing Mania. I'm Kim, a book marketing strategist for Christian authors, and I'm so thrilled you're here to learn how to grow your author platform, market your book on podcast, and steward your message in a way that honors God and your time. So let me ask you today, have you started a podcast to grow your author platform and market your book to more readers in less time? If no, we got to talk. If yes, do you find yourself wondering how to get more people to listen to your show and how to promote it in ways that don't feel yucky? Then I've got good news for you today, because guesting on other people's podcasts is the best way to grow your own show. Seriously, podcast listeners love discovering new shows to listen to. And where they love discovering them is inside the app where they're already tuned in to their favorite shows. Forget battling that Instagram algorithm in hopes that your target readers will see your podcast promotion. Take their time to go off of social media to go listen to your show right then. That's probably not going to happen these days. But when you make it so easy peasy during your interview to take action to follow and listen to your podcast in the app they're already in, boom, y'all, it's a no-brainer for listeners. I know this is true because I do it every day. I love listening to podcasts. Big surprise, I know. When I'm listening to podcast interviews in my app on my phone, I hear a guest mention they have a podcast, or I might even hear it in the host introduction. And I immediately pause the episode, go find the guest show and follow it. And I might even check out the most recent episodes while I'm there and save them to listen to instead of waiting for their show to pop up later when a new episode airs. I love having shows queued up for when I walk the dog, do the dishes, drive to pick up my son, hit the elliptical, etc. Then throughout a 30 to 45 minute interview, I get to connect with the guest in my ears. As they start relating to struggles I'm facing and sharing encouragement and tips for me to overcome those issues, I'm hooked. I get to know them like they're my friend, and I automatically associate the guest voice with the solution to my problems. And when the interview is over, all I want is more from them. And where do I find more? On the guest podcast, of course. And if they've had a super enticing lead magnet, aka freebie, for me to sign up for, hopefully they're also strategic and link their podcast inside of it too. More on that in a bit. So now I'm a listener of their show and get to hear their voice encouraging me on an ongoing basis, and of course sharing how their book is the next best step to help me beyond the podcast. Then I'm all in and headed to Amazon to buy, y'all. Now, are you with me? Do you agree that guesting is the best way for you to grow your own podcast? Ready to go pitch yourself to guest on other shows? Okay, well, tap the brakes for just a second, because before you start pitching yourself to guest on podcasts to grow your own show, there's 4 things I want you to do first. These tips came out of a recent coaching session with a client of mine on her podcast guesting strategy. She had been a guest on a few shows that had aired, and she asked, why isn't this strategy working? She wasn't seeing any results from guesting on other people's podcasts to grow her own show. So we dug deep into what she was doing, and I want to share similar action steps I gave her with you to ensure you see success with the time investment you make into guesting on other people's shows. So number 1, make sure you are consistent with your own show first. In episode 60, I talk about having a consistent online presence, and that includes your podcast. When a host receives your pitch, they will go check you out. And if you're a fellow podcast host, guess where they're probably going to look first? Yep, your podcast. And if you're not showing up consistently to serve your own listeners, why in the world would they think you'll show up as a guest to serve theirs? So as a podcast host, be consistent with your own show first before pitching to guest on others. Now, what does that consistency look like? It's releasing episodes weekly or monthly or seasonally. Just be consistent and make it obvious to listeners when they can expect the next episode. If you're like, we were on a break, that's okay. Publish a quick episode that clearly shows in the title that you're on a break and when you'll be back. It can be as simple as, that's a wrap on season 2. See you in August for season 3. That way your target podcast host will be more excited about you sharing your show with their listeners on your guest episode. And y'all, I know things come up. Big emergencies can come up. Or perhaps you've just decided podcasting isn't for you this season. I do have some ideas on planning ahead to communicate last-minute breaks to your listeners, so stay tuned for that episode. So number 1, before pitching to guest on podcasts to grow your own show, make sure you are consistent with your own listeners first. Then number 2, if you are an interview-only show, air a few solo episodes. Why? So listeners can continue to get to know you and continue the conversation that was started on the podcast you guested on. As I mentioned, listeners feel connected to you after hearing you on a 30 to 45-minute interview. They heard about your own podcast. They pop over to learn more from you there, and all they see are guest episodes where you're talking about somebody else's book and possibly somebody else's podcast too. Womp, womp, y'all. That's what happened with my client. The listeners were engaged with her as a guest, but then when they went to connect further on her podcast, they scroll and scroll looking for an episode with her name on it. But all they see are guest episodes that have nothing to do with what she talked about when she was a guest on a podcast. And so if your goal of hosting a podcast is to get your target readers to connect with you, especially as an author, then they need to hear your voice more than they do your guest. They need to hear the message of your book more than they do your guest books. And most important, they need to hear a similar message of what you shared as a guest on the episode they just heard. Now, if you're a solo show, hopefully you already have this covered and the topic of your show is in alignment with the topics you share when you guest on podcast. And if you need some help with that, let me know. But if not, air a few solo episodes. They can be short and sweet and even bonus episodes, but serve up some solo content for new listeners to discover when they first check out your show. Then, number 3, air a roundup episode highlighting your most popular past episodes and tie those into the topic that you've been sharing as a guest. So if you're a solo show, a roundup gives you a chance to highlight some past shows that have really resonated with your listeners. And same with highlighting your interviews with your guest. But I want to pause here just a second because we always want to keep in mind our goal for podcast guesting. So right now we're talking about the goal of growing your own podcast by being a guest on others. So again, if you're an author and you're wanting target readers to connect with you and learn more about your book on your podcast, your topics are going to be in alignment with that, or they should be. However, I know some of you may not have a book yet and you're podcasting to build your author platform. And you're having guests on to build relationships with more peers and authors who are serving your target readers. In that case, you may truly be focusing on growing your show, period, to grow your platform, and not have anything to do with a book yet. And in that case, I really want you to think about the topic you're sharing as a guest. If you're going to lead listeners back to your show and then even serve up a roundup of popular episodes, then have that align with what you talk about on podcast as a guest. Your podcast likely has a specific niche to it and a specific problem you're solving, and you could create a guest podcast topic around that and even talk about the amazing conversations you've had on the show with your guest. Then the listeners you're serving automatically want to come and get some more of that. So back to the roundup. Let's say your speaking topics are encouragement for moms. You could do a roundup of your past episodes with your guests that encourage moms. There's probably many you have interviewed if you're an interview show. And then just give your own spin on it that's related to your niche topic of your book or your podcast. Or go even broader, like another one of my clients is a confidence coach, and she could round up past episodes on her podcast of guests who talked about a variety of topics, and then she could share a takeaway about stepping out in confidence related to that topic. So if she had guests talk about motherhood, talk about parenting, marriage, entrepreneurship, they could be talking about living out their faith. And confidence might not have even necessarily come up in the conversation if that's not what the guest talked about, but that is her niche and the problem she solves. So that would be a supernatural roundup episode on her show to talk about confidence and relate it to some takeaways from her popular episodes. Does that make sense? Airing a roundup episode saves your new listener the trouble of digging through your catalog to find the gems they're looking for. So serve them up right away. There's some instant gratification built in there as they hear you summarizing the kind of content they can expect on your show, and they are going to want to follow the show so they don't miss an episode. Okay, so again, before pitching to guest on podcasts to grow your own show, number 1, make sure you're consistent with your own listeners first. Number 2, air a few solo shows if you're an interview-only show. Number 3, air a roundup episode highlighting your most popular episodes. Then, number 4, create a lead magnet that is a natural next step for your listeners when they hear you as a guest on a podcast. And that really applies to everyone, y'all, who's guesting, whether you're a podcast host or not. But as a host who is guesting to grow their own show, you want to turn listeners into leads with your lead magnet. This was one of the stumbling blocks my client shared in our strategy session that I talked about in the beginning when she was concerned that guesting on other podcasts wasn't resulting in growth of her own show. And when we dug into it, I discovered that she had, a guest speaking topic on one thing that the listeners loved, but then her show talked about a different topic with guests only, talking about their topics and their books. And then her lead magnet was something else totally different than her podcast and her speaking topic. So we got all that cleaned up and aligned. And if you want to grow your own show by guesting on other people's podcasts, you want to give the listeners a way to take action on what they just heard you talk about as a guest. And in that lead magnet, you always want to link to your podcast and, better yet, popular episodes they can listen to, which again would be super easy if you have a roundup episode ready. And if you've been podcasting for a while, you can even provide a podcast guide that lists episodes by topic, and that can be your lead magnet. I'm all about maximizing our podcast content because it's evergreen and there's always new listeners that haven't heard your episodes before. Okay, so to wrap it up, guesting on other people's podcasts is the best way to grow your own show. But before you start, number 1, make sure you're consistent with your own listeners first. Number 2, air a few solo shows if you're an interview-only show. Number 3, air a roundup episode highlighting your most popular episodes. Number 4, create a lead magnet that is a natural next step for your listeners when they hear you as a guest on a podcast. And bonus, be sure and link some popular podcast episodes in your lead magnet. Now, you're ready to get pitching, and I can't wait to see your name pop up as a guest in my podcast player soon. And hey, if you're like, Kim, this all sounds great, but I need some help to get started pitching myself to guest on other people's shows, I got you, girl. For the month of March, I'm offering 50% off my podcast guesting power hours. I've got major spring fever, y'all, and the time change is coming, and I want you to gain back that hour you're going to lose by working with me to spring forward your podcast guesting plan. So spots are limited because I've got 2 boys with 2 different weeks of spring break. So grab one while you can at kimstewartmarketing.com/power hour. And I'll put a link here in your show notes to make it easy peasy on y'all. I hope to see you soon on my calendar. That's all for today, y'all. And as always, I'll be there for you next week to help you market your book one podcast at a time. See you then.